Every Sunday, my husband would leave the house. I never asked why. But one day, he forgot his phone, and a woman called, "Honey, are you on your way?" I drove to the address. What I saw there changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Every marriage has its rhythms, and ours had always felt steady to me. I'm Sarah Hayes. I was 36 years old, and for 11 years I'd built a life with my husband David in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. We had 2 kids, Emma, 10, sharp-tongued and obsessed with horses, and Jack, 7, who still wanted to be carried up the stairs at bedtime even though he was getting too big for it. David ran a small contracting business, Hayes Builders, that he'd started from nothing in his 20s. I'd been the one who quit my marketing job when Emma was born and never quite went back, instead managing the books for David's company part-time from our kitchen table. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was ours, and I had believed, with the kind of unexamined confidence you only have before something breaks it, that it was a good one. David had always golfed on Sundays. That had started years ago, back when his father was alive, and the 2 of them would play 9 holes at the public course on Route 33 before lunch. After his father died, David kept going. Alone, he said, or sometimes with a buddy from the lumber yard. I never thought to question it. It was his one indulgence, his version of church, and frankly, I liked having a few quiet hours with the kids and a cup of coffee that didn't go cold before I finished it. It was around February that I started noticing things I couldn't quite name. David began locking his phone with a passcode, which he'd never bothered with before. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. The Sunday golf trips, which used to end by 2 in the afternoon, started stretching to 5, 6, sometimes later, and he'd come home smelling like coffee instead of grass and sweat. When I asked how the game went, his answers got shorter. Fine, same as always. He stopped telling me who he played with. I told myself I was imagining things. We had 2 kids, a mortgage, a business to run. Wasn't a little distance normal? Didn't every marriage go through quiet seasons? I made excuses for him the way you make excuses for weather, as though his behavior were simply something happening to both of us rather than something he was choosing. But there was a small, cold feeling that had taken up residence somewhere behind my ribs, and it didn't go away no matter how many reasons I gave it to leave. In March, I found a receipt in his work jacket from a furniture store in a part of town we never went to. An end table, $340 paid in cash. When I asked him about it, he said it was for a job site, a model home he was staging for a client. It was possible. It was even plausible. But plausible isn't the same as true. And some part of me had started keeping a private ledger of all the things that almost added up. It was a Sunday in late April when everything cracked open. David had left around 9 that morning with his golf bag, kissed me on the top of the head, told me he loved me. He always told me he loved me, that was never the part that was missing, and backed out of the driveway. I was in the kitchen an hour later, wiping down the counters while Jack built a Lego tower on the floor, when I heard a buzzing sound coming from the junk drawer where we kept old chargers and spare keys. It was David's phone. He'd forgotten it. I almost didn't answer it. That's the truth. For one full second, I almost let it ring out and texted him later that he'd left it behind. But something in me, some instinct I didn't examine too closely, reached over and pressed the screen. "Hey, baby," a woman's voice said, warm and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before my brain had even caught up. "Are you on your way yet? I made coffee." I didn't say anything. I don't think I could have. After a beat of silence, the woman said, "David," and I hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, in my own house, with my son stacking blue and red bricks at my feet, and I felt the entire shape of my life rearrange itself in the space of about 4 seconds. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the counter. Jack looked up at me and asked if I was okay, and I told him I was fine, that I'd just stubbed my toe, and I smiled at him the way you smile when you are holding something together with your bare hands. I called my sister, Megan, and asked if she could come watch the kids for a couple of hours. I told her it was nothing, that I just needed to run an errand. Then I picked up David's phone, scrolled to the recent call log, and found the number, saved under a name that wasn't a name at all, just 3 letters, VC. I copied the area code into my own phone, searched it against an address I found buried in his messages from weeks earlier. A casual mention of the apartment on Hartley, dropped between 2 unrelated texts as if it were nothing. By 11 that morning, I was sitting in my car outside a modest apartment complex 8 miles from our house, watching David's truck parked crooked in a visitor spot, and I understood that nothing about my Sunday or my marriage was ever going to be the way I'd believed it was again. I sat in that parking lot for almost 40 minutes before I made myself drive away. I didn't go up to the apartment. I didn't bang on the door or scream his name into the spring air. Some women might have, and I don't judge them for it, but that has never been who I am. I have always been the kind of person who needs to understand the full shape of a thing before I decide what to do about it, and in that moment, I understood almost nothing, only that my husband had a key to an apartment I'd never heard of, and a woman in it who called him baby and made him coffee on Sunday mornings. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, rehearsing nothing, because there was nothing yet to rehearse. Megan was in the living room with the kids when I walked in, and she took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions in front of Emma and Jack. She just said she'd stay for dinner, and after the kids were in bed, we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd done David's books for 9 years. And I told her everything. "You have to leave him," she said immediately, the way sisters do, fierce and certain on your behalf before you've even decided what you feel. But it wasn't that simple, and I told her so. We had a joint business, a mortgage with both our names on it. 11 years of finances so tangled together that I didn't actually know, in that moment, what was mine and what was his, and what existed only because the 2 of us had built it side by side. If I confronted him that night, screamed and cried and gave him the chance to lie his way through it, I would lose the only advantage I had. He didn't yet know that I knew. That was the first cold, clear thought I had, and it frightened me almost as much as the affair itself, that some part of me was already calculating instead of grieving. But grief, I was learning, could wait. It would still be there later. What couldn't wait was protecting myself and protecting my children, because whatever came next, Emma and Jack were going to need a mother who had her footing. I lay awake most of that night beside David, listening to him breathe evenly in his sleep, feeling like a stranger in my own bed. I thought about the cash receipts, the locked phone, the Sunday trips that had grown longer and longer over months while I'd told myself stories to explain them. And I thought about our joint accounts, the business account I helped manage, the home equity line we'd opened 2 years earlier for a renovation that never fully happened. If David was capable of lying about an apartment and a woman, what else might he be lying about? The next morning, after he left for a job site, I didn't call a lawyer. I wasn't ready for that yet. It still felt too final, too much like setting something in motion I couldn't take back. Instead, I did something smaller, and in hindsight, something that mattered more than I realized at the time. I opened a new bank account in my name only at a credit union across town where David had no accounts and no history. I moved $3,000 from a savings account I rarely touched, money my late grandmother had left me, technically separate property, and told myself it was just a precaution. A small door I was leaving open in a house that suddenly had no exits. Then I started watching the business books more carefully than I had in years. David had always handled the bigger financial decisions, vendor payments, equipment loans, the occasional consulting fee. He said he paid to contractors he trusted on bigger jobs. I'd signed off on things without much scrutiny because I trusted him, because that's what you do in a marriage that's working. Now I went back through 6 months of statements, this time actually reading every line instead of skimming for round numbers. There it was, buried among legitimate expenses, 4 payments over 5 months, each labeled VC Consulting LLC, Strategic Services, totaling just under $14,000. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my coffee going cold, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this wasn't just an affair. David wasn't only lying to me about where he spent his Sundays. He was paying for it, using money that belonged to both of us, to our family, to our children's future, to fund an apartment and a life that didn't include me. I didn't cry that morning, though I'd cried plenty the night before. Instead, I closed the laptop, looked out the window at Jack's bike lying in the driveway where he'd left it, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront David yet. I wasn't going to give him the chance to talk his way around evidence I hadn't fully gathered. I was going to find out exactly how deep this went, protect what I could while he still didn't know I was watching, and when the moment came, I was going to make sure I wasn't the one left standing in the wreckage with nothing. That afternoon, I made an appointment, not with a divorce attorney, not yet, but with a financial advisor 2 towns over, someone who had never met David and never would, someone who could help me understand, quietly and carefully, exactly what was mine. The financial advisor's name was Carol Whitfield, and her office was in a strip mall in Westerville, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. Deliberately unremarkable, I would later think. The kind of place no one from my life would ever wander into by accident. I told her, sitting across from her desk with my hands folded in my lap like a student waiting to be graded, that my husband and I had a contracting business together and that I wanted to understand my financial position in case things changed. She didn't ask what I meant by that. She simply nodded, the way people do when they've heard versions of this sentence 100 times before, and asked me to bring her everything I had. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I almost didn't recognize. Careful, methodical, quiet. I made copies of bank statements when David was at job sites. I photographed the ledger pages I usually kept by hand before updating them digitally, so there would be a record even if he tried to alter anything later. I learned, almost by accident, the difference between marital and separate property in Ohio, and I learned that the home equity line we'd opened, the one meant for a kitchen renovation we'd never gotten around to, had been drawn down by $9,000 more than I'd known about, in increments that lined up almost exactly with the dates of those VC consulting payments. David didn't notice anything different about me. Not at first. I made sure of that. I still packed Jack's lunch with the crusts cut off, still went to Emma's riding lessons on Wednesdays, still asked David how his day went and listened, or pretended to, while he told me about supply costs and a contractor who hadn't shown up on time. But Carol had warned me that people who are hiding something develop a kind of radar, and she was right, because by the second week of May, I started catching small things. David glancing at me a half-second too long when I asked an offhand question about the business account, a new habit of stepping outside to take phone calls instead of staying in the kitchen, the way he'd started locking the filing cabinet in his home office that had never been locked before. I didn't know it yet, but he had started to wonder. The point of no return came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. David had gone to pick up materials for a job, and Emma was at a friend's house, and Jack was napping, and I was alone in the house with an hour I hadn't planned for. I don't know what made me go into his office that day instead of waiting, the way I usually did for moments when I had a clear reason to be in there. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me had simply run out of patience with being careful. The filing cabinet was locked, but I knew where David kept the spare key, taped under the bottom drawer of his desk, a hiding place so obvious it had never once occurred to either of us that it needed to be better. Inside the cabinet, behind tax documents and old invoices, I found a manila folder labeled, in David's handwriting, VC Investment. Inside it was a printed lease agreement for an apartment on Hartley Avenue, signed by a Vanessa Cole, with David's name listed as a co-signer and guarantor. There was a separate sheet, handwritten, that looked like a running tally. Rent, a car payment, something labeled Biz Startup. Numbers added up over what appeared to be the better part of a year, totaling close to $22,000. I sat down on the floor of his office with that folder in my lap and read it twice, then a third time, as though the numbers might change if I looked at them long enough. They didn't. My husband hadn't just had an affair. He had been financing another woman's apartment, her car, and apparently some kind of business venture, using money that came out of accounts with both our names on them, money that should have gone toward our children's college funds, our retirement, our actual life. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. The spare key returned to its hiding place under the drawer. Then I went into the bathroom, locked the door, sat down on the edge of the tub, and let myself cry for the first time in almost 3 weeks. Not the soft, disbelieving tears of that first Sunday, but something harder and angrier, the kind of crying that clears something out of you and leaves room for what comes next. By the time David came home that evening with a bag of takeout and a tired smile, asking how my day had been, I told him it had been quiet, and in a way, that was true. It was the last quiet day I would have for a long time, and somewhere underneath my grief, a colder, steadier part of me had already begun to plan. I met with the divorce attorney the following week. Her name was Linda Park, and her office, unlike Carol's, was downtown, all glass and quiet efficiency, with a view of the Scioto River that I remember staring at while she explained, in calm, practiced language, exactly what dissipation of marital assets meant under Ohio law, and how the photographs I'd taken, the lease, the handwritten ledger, the bank statements, could matter a great deal in court. "You did the right thing, documenting before confronting," Linda told me. "A lot of people blow up the moment they find out, and by the time they call me, the evidence is gone, deleted, shredded, moved. You gave yourself options." She advised me to keep building the file quietly for a few more weeks before filing anything, to secure what separate property I could, and to think carefully about timing, when to move the children's routines, when to talk to a custody evaluator if it came to that, when to finally confront David with what I knew. I left her office that day feeling, for the first time since the phone call in my kitchen, something other than grief. It wasn't quite strength, but it was the beginning of it. I didn't get the luxury of moving at my own pace for long, though. 10 days later, I came home from picking up Jack from school to find David's truck already in the driveway in the middle of a weekday afternoon, which never happened. He was standing in the kitchen with the manila folder. My photographs were one thing, but apparently he'd noticed something out of place in the actual cabinet, some paper not quite squared the way he'd left it, and his face was a color I'd never seen on him before, somewhere between fear and fury. "Were you going through my things?" he asked, and his voice had an edge to it that made Jack, still holding my hand, go very still. I told Jack to go watch something in the living room, and once he was gone, I turned back to David, and for the first time in 3 weeks, stopped pretending. "I know about Vanessa," I said. "I know about the apartment. I know about the $22,000. What followed was not the conversation I had braced myself for. I had expected guilt, maybe even an apology buried somewhere under the panic. Instead, David's fear curdled almost immediately into something harder. He told me I had no idea what I was talking about, that the money was a business investment, that I was twisting things the way I always did when I felt insecure. When I didn't back down, he changed tactics, told me that if I tried to blow up the family over this, I would regret it, that he had friends, that his mother would never forgive me for destroying the kids' home, that I'd end up with nothing because everyone knows you don't actually understand the business finances. It was, I would realize later, exactly the kind of thing people say when they are no longer sure they have the upper hand. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, but I made myself speak slowly. "I have copies of everything," I told him. "The lease, the bank transfers, all of it. So you can decide right now whether you want to talk about this honestly or whether you want to keep threatening me in our kitchen while our son is in the next room." He didn't hit me. He never had, and I want to be clear about that because what happened in our kitchen that day was a different kind of violence. The kind that comes in raised voices and cold accusations, in a man twice reminding me, almost casually, that I had no career, no income of my own, as if that were a fact he could use against me rather than a circumstance we had built together. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me I would lose everything. And then, abruptly, as though he'd heard himself and understood he'd gone too far, he grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door hard enough that a picture frame in the hallway tilted on its nail. I stood in my kitchen, shaking, and went to check on Jack, who was sitting very still in front of the television, clearly having heard more than I wanted him to. I told him Mommy and Daddy were having a disagreement, that everything was going to be okay, and I held him longer than the moment probably called for, mostly for my own sake. David didn't come home that night or the next. When he finally texted 3 days later, it was a single line. "We need to talk when you've calmed down," as though I were the one who'd needed calming. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called Megan and asked if she could take the kids for the weekend, and I drove 2 hours to my parents' lake house in Michigan, alone, and sat on the dock for 2 days doing very little, not planning, not crying, just breathing, watching the water, letting my body remember what it felt like to not be afraid for a few hours at a time. I knew the fight wasn't over, but I also knew, for the first time, that I wasn't going to lose it. When I came back from the lake house, David had changed his approach entirely, the way water changes shape to fit whatever container it's poured into. The threats stopped. In their place came flowers, a bouquet of white peonies left on the kitchen counter with no card, because he knew, I think, that anything he wrote would sound hollow. He started coming home early, helping with homework, cooking dinner for the first time in years, telling Emma and Jack stories at bedtime in a voice pitched for an audience of more than just our children. He told me, one evening while I was loading the dishwasher and he stood too close behind me, that he'd ended things with Vanessa, that it had been a mistake, a midlife thing, that he loved our family and wanted to fix this. I want to be honest about something here. There was a part of me, small and stubborn and 11 years deep into loving this man, that wanted to believe him. That part of me remembered our wedding day, the way he'd cried walking Emma around the hospital room hours after she was born, the ordinary tenderness of 1,000 unremarkable Tuesdays before any of this happened. Grief doesn't disappear just because you've decided to be strategic. It sits right alongside the strategy the whole time, asking quiet, exhausting questions. But I had also spent 3 weeks learning to look at evidence instead of feelings, and the evidence didn't change just because David brought home peonies. The $22,000 was still gone. The lease still had his signature on it, and when I quietly checked, through Carol, whether the payments to VC Consulting had actually stopped, they hadn't. A new transfer, smaller, $1,200, had gone out just 4 days after he told me it was over. So when David sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked, gently, almost pleadingly, whether we could go to counseling together, just to see, I told him I'd think about it. And I meant it, in the sense that I genuinely considered what saying yes would cost me, and what saying no would protect. I didn't owe him a performance of forgiveness while I was still gathering the truth. I told him I needed time, that I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, and I watched something flicker across his face. Not relief exactly, but a kind of recalculation, as though he'd expected either a full collapse into reconciliation or a full explosion of anger, and my calm, unreadable patience left him with neither. He backed off after that. Not entirely. There were still small overtures, a hand on my shoulder that lingered too long, a comment about how the kids seem happier when we were all in the same room. But the intensity dropped, and I understood, watching him, that he and whatever he was discussing with his mother on those long phone calls in the garage had decided to wait and watch, to see whether I would simply tire myself out and settle back into the marriage the way water settles after a storm. I didn't tell him that I had stopped being water. I had become something with edges. What I needed most in those weeks wasn't legal strategy. Linda and Carol were handling that. It was somewhere to put the parts of myself that weren't useful in a courtroom. Megan was a constant. She came over twice a week, sat with me while the kids did homework, never once told me what to do, only asked what I needed, and then did it. I found, almost by accident, a small support group that met on Thursday evenings at a community center across town. A circle of 8 or 9 women, some further along in their own versions of this story than I was, some just beginning to ask the questions I'd asked in February. I went the first time mostly out of curiosity and came back every week after that, because something about sitting in a room of women who didn't need me to explain or justify my anger let me set it down, just for an hour, instead of carrying it everywhere. One woman in that group, a retired teacher named Ruth, who'd gone through her own divorce 15 years earlier, told me something I held on to for the rest of that summer. The version of you that's grieving and the version of you that's protecting yourself aren't enemies, she said. You don't have to pick one. You just can't let either one make all the decisions alone. I thought about that on the drive home, past the same lumber yard where David had once told me, years ago, that he'd met a guy who does good work, a guy who, I now suspected, might have been the first thread in a much longer rope. I didn't know yet exactly how the next confrontation would happen, but I knew I wasn't going back to pretending, and I knew, finally, that I wasn't doing any of this alone. The visit came on a Sunday, fittingly, I would think later, in the middle of June, almost exactly 2 months after the phone call that started everything. David had asked if his mother could come for dinner, just to talk as a family, and against my better judgment, I said yes. Part of me wanted witnesses to whatever came next. Part of me, I'll admit, still wanted to believe that Diane, who had hugged me at my own wedding and called me her daughter for over a decade, might actually be on my side. She wasn't. Diane arrived with a casserole dish, the way she always did, kissed my cheek, asked about the kids' summer plans, and for the first 20 minutes of that dinner, it almost felt normal. Jack telling her about a frog he'd caught, Emma showing off a riding ribbon, David quieter than usual but trying. It was only after the kids were excused to the living room that the real conversation began, and I understood within minutes that this had never been about reconciliation at all. David told me everything, Diane said, folding her hands on the table the way she did when she was about to deliver something she considered wisdom. I think it's important we all remember what's actually at stake here. Emma and Jack have a home, a family. Are you really willing to throw that away over a mistake? I asked her evenly whether she'd known about the apartment on Hartley Avenue. There was a pause, half a second too long, before she said she didn't know the details, which was its own kind of answer. I told her about the lease, about the $22,000, about the fact that David's mistake had a name, a rent payment, and apparently a business plan. Diane's expression shifted, the warmth in it tightening into something more practiced. "You have to understand," she said, "men make poor decisions sometimes, but that doesn't mean you tear apart everything you've built. Think about what people will say. Think about your children growing up with parents who couldn't work through a hard season." There it was. Not concern for me, not even concern for the children in any way that centered their actual well-being, but concern for appearances, for the story the family would tell at holidays, for a version of peace that required only my silence and my forgiveness, indefinitely in exchange for nothing. David sat beside her, nodding along, occasionally adding a quiet, "She's right, Sarah," as though this were a negotiation he'd outsourced to his mother because he knew his own words no longer carried weight with me. I let them finish. I'd learned that much from the support group, that you don't have to interrupt people to disagree with them, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone fully reveal themselves before you respond. When Diane finally ran out of things to say, I told her, calmly, that I understood she loved her son and wanted to protect him, and that I respected that as a mother myself. But I told her I would not be staying in a marriage to protect anyone's reputation, including my own. I told her that what David had done wasn't a hard season, it was a choice, repeated over the better part of a year, funded with money that belonged to his children as much as to him. And I told her, gently but without flinching, that if she ever again tried to make me feel responsible for decisions David alone had made, that conversation would be the last one we had. Diane's face changed entirely then. The soft, grandmotherly warmth gone in an instant, replaced by something sharper. "You'll regret this," she said. "You think you know everything, but you have no idea what kind of fight this is going to be." David beside her didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He looked at his mother, as though waiting for her to fix what he himself had broken. And in that moment, watching the two of them, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself see before. This had never just been about Vanessa. There was a whole architecture of denial and protection around David, and his mother was one of its load-bearing walls. They left shortly after, Diane's casserole dish forgotten on the counter, the air behind them thick with something cold. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment after the door shut, my heart pounding, my hands cold despite the June warmth outside. I won't pretend I wasn't frightened. There was a real fear in me, the fear of a woman who has just watched two people who claim to love her threaten her instead, the fear of not knowing exactly what kind of fight Diane meant. But underneath the fear was something steadier, something that had been building in me for 2 months. I went and found my phone, and I texted Linda Park, "I'm ready to file." The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late July in a conference room at Linda's office with the same view of the river I remembered from my first visit there in May. By then, the divorce filing had been served for 3 weeks, and David had retained his own attorney, a sharp, expensive-looking man named Robert Castellano, who I suspected had been chosen specifically to intimidate. David and Diane had spent those 3 weeks, according to mutual friends who still spoke to me, telling a particular version of events around town, that I had blindsided David, that I was being vindictive, that the business, and by extension, David's entire professional reputation, was at risk because of my personal vendetta. I walked into that conference room that morning wearing a navy blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, carrying a folder considerably thicker than the one I'd photographed in David's office 2 months earlier. Carol had spent weeks tracing every dollar, not just the $22,000 to Vanessa's apartment and car, but a pattern of withdrawals going back nearly 14 months, totaling closer to $31,000, some of it diverted through the business account in ways that, Carol gently pointed out, likely constituted not just dissipation of marital assets, but possible misuse of business funds that David's own business partner, a man named Greg who co-owned 40% of Hayes Builders and who, it turned out, had no idea any of this had been happening, would have a serious interest in. David looked tired when he walked in, the kind of tired that comes from maintaining a story for too long. Robert Castellano opened with the argument I'd expected, that the VC consulting payments were legitimate business expenses, that I was misinterpreting normal cash flow, that my claims were emotional rather than factual. I let Linda do most of the talking at first. She laid out the lease agreement with David's signature as guarantor. She laid out the bank records showing the timing of each transfer, matching almost exactly with rent due dates on an apartment that had never once appeared on any Hayes Builders invoice, expense report, or tax filing as a legitimate business expense. She laid out the forensic accountant's report, Carol's report, tracing the money cleanly, dollar for dollar, in a way that left very little room for the word misinterpreting. It was when Linda mentioned, almost in passing, that we had also informed Greg of the business account discrepancies and that he had independently begun asking his own attorney to review the company's books, that I watched something genuinely break in David's composure. He looked at Robert. Robert looked at his notes, and for the first time since that Sunday in April, I watched my husband, who had spent 2 months alternating between threats and flowers, between his mother's manipulations and his own, visibly run out of a story to tell. "This is insane," David said, his voice rising in a way it hadn't in that careful conference room before. "You're trying to destroy my business over a mistake. Greg doesn't need to be involved in this." "Greg is your business partner," I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, and I heard my own voice come out steady, almost unfamiliar in its calm. "He has every right to know that company funds were used to finance an apartment for your girlfriend. That's not me destroying anything, David. That's just what happens when you build something on money that wasn't only yours to spend." Robert tried to regroup, suggesting a recess, but Linda, unbothered, simply asked whether they'd like to discuss settlement terms now or continue contesting the asset findings in front of a judge, where the same evidence would be entered into a public record. I watched David's face as he understood, fully for the first time, what that would mean, not just for our divorce, but for Hayes Builders, for his standing with clients who trusted him precisely because he'd built a reputation as a steady, honest local contractor. Diane wasn't in the room that day, but David called her during the recess, and through the thin conference room wall I could hear his voice rising and falling, pleading, and at one point clearly frustrated, saying, "She has everything, Mom. She has all of it." There was no triumph in hearing that, not really. Mostly just a strange, quiet exhaustion, the feeling of a long fever finally breaking. When we reconvened 20 minutes later, Robert Castellano's posture had changed entirely. The conversation that followed was no longer about whether I had evidence. It was about how much it was going to cost David to make this go away with his business and what remained of his reputation intact. The settlement that emerged over the following 6 weeks was, by any measure, decisive. David, advised by Robert Castellano that contesting the asset findings in open court risked far more public exposure than settling quietly, agreed to terms that gave me the house outright, paid off using his share of the business buyout, since Greg, once he saw the forensic accounting report, made it clear he no longer wanted David as a full partner and offered to buy him out at a reduced valuation, citing breach of fiduciary trust in the partnership agreement. I was awarded primary custody of Emma and Jack, with David receiving standard visitation, and the court ordered restitution of the $31,000 in dissipated assets to be repaid from his share of the business sale, directly into an account earmarked for the children's education. It wasn't a number that erased 2 months of fear or 11 years of a marriage I'd believed in, but it was, undeniably, a complete and unambiguous outcome, not a messy compromise where both sides walked away wounded and uncertain, but a clear accounting of what had happened and who was responsible for it. Vanessa Cole's role in all of it became public in a way none of us, including her, had anticipated. Because the lease named her as the primary tenant and David as guarantor, and because the funds had been traced through both personal and business accounts, her name appeared in the court filings, public record in Ohio, available to anyone who looked. It didn't take long for that to reach people in town who knew both families. Worse for her, the biz startup funds David had given her, meant to help her open a small boutique fitness studio, were now subject to a civil claim from Greg's attorneys, who argued, not without merit, that some of that money had originated from Hayes Builders' accounts rather than David's personal funds. Vanessa, I heard secondhand, ended up settling her own dispute with the business, paying back a portion of what she'd received, and the fitness studio she'd been planning never opened. Diane fared no better, though her losses were of a different kind. Word of the mediation and of her role in covering for David's calls and providing cover stories about his Sunday whereabouts spread through their extended family with the particular speed that family gossip always seems to find. 2 of David's cousins, both of whom I'd remained close to, told me separately that they were furious with Diane for lying to everyone, myself included, for the better part of a year. By the fall, I heard that Diane had stopped attending the same church she'd gone to for 20 years, after a friend there confronted her about the rumors. Her relationship with David himself, ironically, grew strained too. He blamed her, fairly or not, for encouraging him to fight rather than come clean months earlier for the advice that had cost him a business partnership he'd spent 15 years building. I want to be honest that there was no single moment of pure triumph in any of this. Divorce, even a clearly won one, doesn't work that way. There were nights that fall when I sat alone after the kids were asleep and cried, not over David specifically, but over the 11 years, over the version of my life I'd believed in that had simply never existed the way I thought it did. Grief and vindication can occupy the same body at the same time. I learned that more thoroughly than I ever wanted to. But there was also, unmistakably, a kind of clean relief that settled into our house once the legal process finished. I no longer flinched when David's name appeared on my phone. I no longer lay awake doing math about what I might lose. The house, paid off, fully mine, felt for the first time in months like it actually belonged to me, in every sense of the word. Emma, who'd understood more of what had happened than I'd realized, told me one evening, completely unprompted, that she was proud of how I'd handled everything. And I had to leave the room for a minute so she wouldn't see me cry over a sentence I hadn't expected from a 10-year-old. By October, the worst of it was over. David had moved into a rental across town. Greg had restructured the business under a new name, Westbrook Contracting, and asked me, somewhat to my own surprise, whether I'd be interested in coming on part-time to help manage the books again, this time as an actual employee with an actual salary, not as an unpaid extension of a marriage. I said yes. The year that followed looked nothing like the one before it, and I mean that in every way I could have hoped for. I started working 3 days a week at Westbrook Contracting, and within 6 months Greg had me handling not just the books, but client relations too, something I discovered I was genuinely good at, a skill I'd apparently been quietly building for 9 years without ever calling it a career. By the following spring, I'd enrolled in 2 evening courses toward a business certification I'd abandoned back when Emma was born. And for the first time since I was 25, I felt like I was building something that was entirely, unambiguously mine. The house filled back up with a kind of ease I hadn't realized had gone missing until it returned. Emma's riding lessons continued, and she placed second at a regional competition that spring, and I cried in the stands in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. Jack, who'd been quieter than usual during the worst of the divorce, slowly came back to himself, louder at the dinner table, full of frog facts again, asking if David could come to his soccer games, which David did, reliably, on his assigned weekends, and which I let happen without the static resentment I might have expected, because by then enough time had passed that I could separate David the husband who lied to me from David the father who, whatever else was true, still loved his kids. I started seeing someone the following winter, a man named Marcus, a structural engineer Greg had introduced me to through a job site, kind in a steady, unhurried way that felt entirely unfamiliar after 11 years with David, in a good way. I want to be careful here, because this isn't a story about being rescued by a new relationship. I'd done the harder work of rebuilding myself long before Marcus ever asked me to coffee. But it was, undeniably, good to be looked at again by someone whose interest in me had no hidden ledger behind it. Vanessa's life, by contrast, seemed to unravel in slow motion over that same year, the kind of decline that's almost uncomfortable to witness even from a distance, even when you feel you have every right to witness it. The fitness studio never materialized. The civil settlement with Westbrook Contracting ate through most of what David had given her. I heard through the same network of mutual acquaintances that had once made me feel exposed and now mostly just kept me informed that she and David had broken up entirely by that summer. Apparently, the relationship hadn't survived contact with real consequences. The rent payments and legal fees and the particular strain of being publicly known in a town that wasn't large, as the woman named in a contractor's embarrassing divorce filing. By the following year, she'd moved out of state, and the apartment on Hartley Avenue, the one I'd sat outside of on that first terrible Sunday, had new tenants who had no idea what had unfolded there. Diane's decline was quieter, but, in its way, sadder. The rift with her own extended family never fully healed. She'd lied to people for the better part of a year, and trust, once spent that thoroughly, doesn't rebuild on its own timeline. She stopped seeing Emma and Jack as often as she once had. Not because I forbade it, I never did that, but because the kids, especially Emma, who was old enough to understand more than Diane probably realized, grew quietly cooler toward a grandmother who'd spent that dinner trying to convince their mother to stay silent. David, for his part, told me once, in one of the brief, business-like conversations we still had about custody logistics, that he and his mother barely spoke anymore. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. Mostly, I just felt the particular sadness of watching a family that had once felt whole to me come apart in pieces, slowly, under the weight of choices none of them had been honest about until it was too late. As for David himself, Westbrook contracting thrived without him, which I think was its own kind of verdict on what he'd actually contributed versus what he'd taken. He started over with a smaller outfit, rebuilding a reputation he'd spent 15 years earning and then quietly spent in a single year. I didn't wish him harm. I'd stopped. Somewhere in that year of rebuilding my own life, needing him to suffer in order to feel like I'd won. I'd already won in every way that mattered. I had my children, my house, my own income, my own name no longer tangled up in his decisions. What David did with the rest of his life was, finally and completely, no longer my responsibility to manage. Looking back, I learned that patience and self-protection aren't the opposite of love. They're what real love for yourself and your children actually looks like. I didn't win by screaming. I won by staying quiet, gathering proof, and trusting people who could help me. The ones who begged me to stay silent for the family were only protecting themselves. So I'll ask you what I still ask myself. If that phone rang in your kitchen, what would you do? Confront or wait? Tell me in the comments. If this story moved you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening.